Are you pleased? Are you surprised? Are you excited about the degree to which states are taking action on some of these issues that you've been drawing attention to for several years now?
I'm not surprised. I am cautiously pleased, I think is a way to phrase that. I think I'm cautiously pleased. We see Youngkin banning CRT, and it looks like he's taking a strong stance in Virginia. That's encouraging. We see many of these state legislatures reaching out and asking me or asking Chris Rufo or any of these other people kind of working in the space. We see all these new transparency bills coming. We see anti-CRT bills coming. I've talked to, state legislators in, I don't know how many states now, over a dozen at least, that are moving on this. They're not just looking to make legislation, but to put teeth in it. But there are a few things I'm also concerned about, because there are a lot of political vultures out there, for example, who will see now that, wow, look at what happened with Youngkin. CRT is a winning issue, or even this, parents' rights thing is a winning issue. Let's make sure we keep the conditions alive that allow us to campaign and fundraise, et cetera, on this. In other words, I call this a stage 2 cancer problem. Let's keep this cancer at stage 2 and turn it into a political cash cow and, vote winner. And that's a terrible idea when you're playing with something that boils down to Marxism. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm worried that the political machine will take this up in a way that this isn't like the gun debate or the abortion debate or any of these other things that kind of have this perennial non-solved problem that everybody gets to campaign on. This is a very different kind of thing, because critical Marxism is so insidious and operates, by getting inside of things and infiltrating them and slowly poisoning them from within.
But I think that's a really interesting point you just drew attention to, of the sort of incentives that are in place to sometimes not solve problems. And just last weekend, we had another interviewee, Magat Wade, who was talking about this in the context of Africa, and she's a big proponent of free markets to potentially bring solutions to Africa. And she talks about actually a lot of these nonprofits that exist to help Africa aren't interested in solving some of the issues of poverty and water access and whatever, because if they do, all these people are out of a job. And it's maybe somewhat similar to some of these campaign operatives who are interested in sort of prolonging this potentially as an issue to campaign on.
Yeah, I don't think that obviously is something that is honorable in any way. And it's kind of disgusting when you talk about these issues with, something like trying to build up infrastructure for African communities that are suffering tremendously because they lack that kind of infrastructure, or at least in part because they lack that kind of infrastructure. But again, it's crucial to understand that the point of a critical theory is to worm its way into something and to slowly poison it from within. In fact, the whole theory is constructed around the idea of dominance and subordination. And dominance is the evil thing, and everything that supports dominance has to be kind of passively aggressively attacked from underneath, has to be ruthlessly criticized, as Marx put it. Ruthless criticism of all that exists is what he said, until it kind of falls apart. And you can see that. It doesn't matter whether it's Max Horkheimer or Herbert Marcuse, these being very famous critical theorists through the middle part of the 20th century. They said, we can't tell you what the ideal society looks like in the terms of the existing society. This is Max Horkheimer paraphrasing very closely an interview he gave in 1969. And he says, but what we can do is criticize the existing society. And Marcuse says the same thing. We shouldn't be trying to cast a positive image. Instead, what we should be doing is using negative thinking, relentlessly criticizing the existing society so that the ideal society that's contained within it can blossom, which is kind of an alchemy-based line of thinking. Like, it's some kind of magic. If we tear down the structure, that some magic new seed will blossom. And so you can't let that in part way, because anything that tries to stay over it will be interpreted as domination. Anything that tries to control it or keep the cancer at stage 2 will be perceived as domination. And that's what must be overthrown. And in fact, what it is the subordinated are to keeping, and not to get too philosophical with Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, the slave morality is to subvert and flip over the dominant morality from within. This is what Gramsci referred to as hegemony, and getting inside and creating a counter hegemony. So the subordinated thing will become the dominating thing in time. And it's only a matter of time if you try to let it in. So the stage 2 cancer game, you're going to lose the patient in the end. And the patient in this case is the Republic.
So this dovetails very nicely with what sort of prompted my reaching out to you, which was my discussion with Charles Pincourt last week, where he was talking about this slow movement he's describing it in the engineering faculty. And he's saying that first there's a couple of people, and at that point they're sort of masquerading their intent. They're masquerading perhaps some of the content of what they want to do. And then once they reach that sort of critical mass, whether it's 40%, 50% of the faculty, then sort of the screen is lifted and you see the exact particulars of some of the goals they have and the sort of worldview that they're advancing. And I think what's so interesting about Charles' book, and this was sort of the focus of our conversation, and it intersects with what you were talking about, the state legislatures, is what I was impressed with Charles's book was this call to action at the end. And I think at this point, I know maybe some people still have their head in the sand, but I think a lot of people are aware of what they're seeing and they don't like it. And what I liked about Charles' book is that it's a roadmap for what to do about it in the academy. And then, so maybe you could talk a little about how you got to know Charles, sort of what prompted you to want to get involved in his project, and maybe furthermore, the degree to which some of those strategies that he's suggesting in the academy can also play out in other areas in what you described as this broader project of trying to save the Republic.
Right. So I'll actually start with that last part. So the book Counter Wokecraft, and I'll tell you kind of how I met Charles and got involved with the project in a moment. The book Counter Wokecraft is actually it's basically, he sent it to me and I saw it and I said, this is the perfect roadmap for dealing with this problem at the institutional level. There are multiple levels upon which this has to be dealt with. We need some kind of cultural awakening where, you said the head in the sand. People need to be aware of actually what's happening and the degree of threat. This isn't just some well-meaning people causing some weird problems by caring too much about trans identities or racial issues or whatever. There's actually a lot more going on here.
Well, one thing, if I could just say,
go ahead.
That I think maybe woke a lot of people up, and I talk about this a lot, that one of the biggest concerns for me is how these ideologies might affect medicine. And I think recent reporting at the Boston Free Beacon about some of the policies in Wisconsin and Minnesota about the distribution of healthcare is pretty glaring, and I think should be pretty darn concerning, because this is no longer, oh, well, these are ideas on paper. This is impacting potentially people getting life-saving medical care. So I think that would be an amazing catalyst. And I know you talk about this, and other people do, about this idea of a woke breaking point. And I would think that for a lot of people, that would be it. I'm at the hospital and someone else is getting preference, even if they have a less severe condition based on an immutable characteristic.
I absolutely agree. If that doesn't scare you rather profoundly, I'm not quite sure what will. So I'm hoping that people will, kind of open their eyes to what's going on with medicine. They flirted with this all the way back with the vaccine. They were going to distribute it to Black and brown, as they say, populations first, which is really funny given that all they ever talk about is the systemic racism in medicine. And then they cite Tuskegee, and then they tried to replicate that with experimental mRNA vaccines on Black people first. Like, what? And so, but if this doesn't kind of open your eyes, that you have schools like the T.H. Chan School of Public Health declaring that racism is a public health threat. You have municipalities, cities saying racism is a public health threat. You have states like New York saying that racism is a public health threat. And then you just saw for 2 years what they're going to do with public health. And if you don't see this as an alarming feature, then you should. And like I said previously, Counter Wokecraft is basically the ideal manual for what to do if you're in an institutional setting to start turning this around at that level, whether that's in the university and the academy through faculty meetings and whatever other kinds of administrative meetings they do, committee meetings and so on, or whether you're in a state legislature and you're dealing with a couple of woke legislators who got elected in their various districts or whatever. So how I got involved with the project actually is I was vaguely aware of Charles and the stuff he was doing on his blog. And I knew that he had written some, really kind of tight articles for Aereo magazine and had kind of kept up with those a little bit. And then he sent me this link one day and he said, I've actually kind of taken a bunch of my blog posts and fleshed them out and tightened it up and turned it into this manual. I don't know if you want to help me kind of get attention to it. And so I was like, well, let me take a look at it. And it took me forever. I feel so bad now because it could have been so much sooner. It took me forever to find the time to open this thing and read it. And I started reading it and I was like, holy cow, this is actually really good. And so I reached out to him with the idea of, hey, what if we publish this as a book and just try to get a lot of eyeballs on it that way and put some some weight behind it as it being, a printed book rather than just a PDF floating around connected to a blog. And so he loved the idea, and we took off. And so I read through, obviously at this point, I read through the manuscript again, and I gave him just an absurd number of suggestions, like add this, you might want to think about that, and just pages and pages and pages and pages, the poor guy. And he loved all of it and took it. And that's where my name ended up getting stuck on the cover, was that I'd given him so many suggestions. I actually, just to be completely upfront, I didn't write a word of that book other than the foreword. I didn't write a single word of it. It's all Charles's work. But I gave him just like pages and pages and pages and pages of suggestions for improvement, probably dozens of pages worth. And he took almost all of the suggestions and fleshed them out. And the product comes out, I think, really great, describing, what the problem of wokeness is, what is its ideology, what is this thing that's creeping in, and then how does it actually do it, and then, what kind of responses. So state legislators working on this, even governors, anybody in an institutional setting. I know there's this new project happening, the University of Austin, that just opened. It's supposed to be like, anti-woke, a bid at
Well,
making
we just the other day, Vahaken interviewed Peter Bergezian, your former co-author, and he was talking about this a lot, this idea of the purpose of education and the potential of the University of Austin. And I think a fundamental question that a lot of us are grappling with, and I actually come down on the side of the issue, and I was talking about this in another episode I did the other day, is whether higher education at places like I went to school is salvageable. And I don't think it is. So I think that the goal might be for people to start to form their own alternatives, like the University of Austin, like Stephen Blackwood's project in Savannah, Georgia.
Yeah.
But that's an open question, I guess. It
is an open question, and I have my own view on it. I think, though, that these projects like Ralston University with Stephen Blackwood and University of Austin, I think if they're not incorporating the wisdom that Charles, or the strategy even that Charles put down in Counter Wokecraft, that they're doomed, because they must understand the insidious nature of how this creeps in. And unless you have what Charles is giving is something very unique, because usually the way that very insidious kind of Marxist type infiltration gets taken care of is through these kind of like very heavy-handed purges, or even adopting authoritarianism. And if you want to do it through liberal means,
that's something he and I talked about.
He's written the book on how to do that at institutional level. My view on the bigger question is that I think that I think that higher education, as it is, it has to be massively reformed from within, is salvageable. But the way that it'll be salvaged requires alternatives putting enough market pressure on them.
I think that's a great point. It's that is a variable in the sort of framework by which this operates. And it's interesting you mentioned state legislators and a few kind of rogue people coming in there. And I think it's not a place where you think about it quite as often, except in Congress with the squad. But I remember visiting the Delaware State Capitol of all places in 2019. I was speaking with a security guard there who was an Air Force veteran. And he said in the past couple of years, he had worked there, I think, for about 3 decades. And he said it's only in the past couple of years where there's been this new crop of people who have this attitude that we will not negotiate, we will not accept the terms of how this body has operated since the 1780s, that we are just, it's our way or the highway. And he was describing this. And at the time I thought, okay, but now as I look back on it, I guess we're seeing that in a lot of places politically, and it's all been happening, in my view, pretty quickly, or at least it's been manifesting pretty quickly, or coming to the surface pretty quickly, even though it's been percolating for a while.
That's right. And so what we're actually watching is the tyranny of a absolutely intolerant small minority through a process that's known as renormalization. So the renormalization, there's a great video floating around somewhere that I'm just going to steal from. So the example they give is a family, and they end up with we'll say a daughter, but it could be anybody. They have a say there's mom, dad, 3 kids or whatever, and then there's a daughter, and she decides she's vegan and is absolutely intolerant. It's like, well, pick the chicken out of your pasta then, no, it touched it, that absolutely intolerant about this. And so this puts whoever's doing the cooking, mom or dad or whatever, into this decision. I was going to say dilemma, but there's multiple prongs. There are only so many solutions to this problem of this absolutely intolerant child demanding veganism. And one is that you make multiple meals. That's a lot of extra work. One is that you make the child that's vegan make their own meals. And they're like, okay, you can be vegan, but you're going to do it yourself. When I'm not making a multiple, by the way, this is the correct solution. And then another is, though, that you just cave in and make one meal and you make it vegan. Another, I guess, would be kind of a hybrid, is that you make a vegan meal and you cook the chicken or something off to the side.
I don't know.
And
When I
people
was a
think
kid, they would have just said, eat the damn chicken. I don't know.
yeah, I know. Same here. But when you have this, there is that too. So it turns out that the most convenient solution that creates the most peace and simplicity in an otherwise, already difficult situation is often to cave into the absolutely intolerant minority.
Mhm.
And that's all of a sudden now you have a whole family that's vegan. And then the video, it says, well, now they're going to go to the neighborhood potluck barbecue or whatever, and now there have to be vegan options at that. So everybody has to now think in terms of, how do we accommodate the vegan? How do we accommodate the most intolerant one child, is what it really boils down to, because nobody else would necessarily do it. And so you can kind of see how this process can spread when you have somebody who's absolutely intolerant. And like you said, the correct answer to these problems is to recognize when somebody's being absolutely intolerant and it's our way or the highway, and they're willing to completely, in fact, to not only overthrow something that's been, say, the process since the 1780s, but to say that process was born in some evil, it needs to be completely reimagined, and we're the only ones who can reimagine it correctly. The correct thing to do with those people is to get rid of them. They are the problem. And we were too soft. We were too open-minded to them. We were too unwilling to look mean. We were also, legally speaking, in many cases, so worried about the fact that they would come back with discrimination lawsuits or whatever on bogus grounds, or sexual harassment lawsuits on bogus grounds or whatever else, that the safe bet turned out to be to renormalize entire industries, entire institutions around the ideas of a wholly intolerant and catastrophic ideology.
So is there an inverse lesson for people who are opposed to this, to be intolerant to tolerating kind of the creep of wokeism?
Well, I mean, not that he's overall the best philosopher in the world to invoke on anything, but if we look at Karl Popper's Paradox of Tolerance, which is only a paragraph in a much longer book where he talks about it, he actually gives you the right formula. When do you draw the line and decide we're not actually, and when we're not going to tolerate this? But then we also have to say, what do we mean by tolerate? We're not going to tolerate this within our institution and levers of power is a different question from we're not going to tolerate this as in you can't have your own personal beliefs. In the United States, you are guaranteed, if you want to be a completely lunatic communist, you are guaranteed the right to your personal conscience, to your faith, if you will. And so First Amendment guarantees the right that you can be a communist and you can speak communist propaganda and you can do whatever you can push it however you want. But there's no guarantee in the Constitution that says you get to have your hands on the levers of power as a result, or that you get to have dominion over other people as a result. That's in fact the street preacher example, like the guy standing there with his megaphone driving people crazy, yammering about everybody going to hell or whatever, and literally nobody listens. If you want to be a communist, no, we don't put that guy because he says everybody's going to go to hell if you don't listen to me. We don't give him a job at the Pentagon because of that, right? We don't make him a university administrator. And so there's this difference about what tolerance means. But what Popper says in that paragraph is when they're absolutely resistant to counter argument, when they are actually acting in a way that's intolerant of other viewpoints, and when it's especially getting to the point where they're willing to use violence. At those points, we certainly should not be tolerant. But when they says that they cannot be persuaded by rational argument, actually, he says when they can't be persuaded by rational argument or evidence, when they cannot be held in check by public opinion, and they are intolerant before the point of knives and guns, then you can be intolerant against that. And so that's actually the criterion. If they are absolutely impossible to convince, if they dismiss any evidence that counters their view as some conspiracy against them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then we are under no obligation to be tolerant to that if it's a spreading, creeping problem. If people want to be in a cult in the United States, you can be in a cult as long as it's not doing illegal activity. You can have whatever weird beliefs you want. They can be as intolerant as you want them to be. Doesn't matter, as long as you keep them kind of quiet and in the house. But if you can't keep it in check by public opinion, if it's creeping broadly, then the demand for intolerance to prevent an intolerant ideology from taking over is a necessity.
But I think in many cases, a lot of these people just on the face of it, deny the project of rationality and say that it's a relic of white supremacy or that it's fundamentally tied with the various oppressions of the past. And just
Yeah, of course.
from Jump Street, they're not interested in that project whatsoever.
Which is why they should not be tolerated according to the paradox of intolerance. And so let me actually just correct that view that you just gave. You are right, by the way, but I want to add depth. And so the view that you've prescribed, the rationality itself, for example, or objectivity itself, or merit itself, are concepts that are tied up as relics of white supremacy, the relics of whatever oppressions and unfairness and injustice or whatever. This is Marxism. This is the essence of Marxism. It must be understood that this is Marxism. So what Marx said was that there is the working class that do productive work, the proletariat, and then there is the bourgeoisie, that is those that operate within what he called the superstructure of society. That they do like the legal stuff, they are the priest class, they are the journalists, they do non-productive work. And in an ideal workers society, commune society, you don't need any of those people. And so that's, of course, for him, the ideal state of society. So those people that work in the superstructure and the superstructure itself are not necessary. It's all junk floating on top of the real society. And so they create justifications for why they should exist. Those justifications are what Marx called ideology. In fact, it's a big mythology for why do you need priests? Why do you need lawyers? Why do you need journalists? You don't really need any of this stuff. You need people swinging a hammer and wielding a sickle. You don't need any of those people. So they create a big mythology about how society works. And that mythology justifies why you have a priest, why you have a lawyer, why you have a journalist, why you have all these superstructural entities who don't, managers in government, they don't do anything productive according to Marxism. And those ideologies say, oh, well, I'm in my position because I have merit. It's objectively true that you actually do have to mediate differences within opinion and conflict within society. So we need magistrates and we need lawyers that can work out what the law is and how that conflict is going to be resolved. You need somebody, if you're going to have a faith, that can minister the theology to you. You need these are actually things that make society work. And they would say, no, that's an ideology. Merit, I deserve my position, is part of that ideology. I've worked my way here and you didn't, so I deserve it. That's part of the ideology. And so when it's a relic of white supremacy is the superstructural ideology of critical race theory.
Right.
It's as a Marxist theory of race. And so what they're actually saying in that case is that people are using ideas like merit or rationality or empiricism or whatever to justify the fact that they get to have power over other people in a completely illegitimate circumstance. So when they say that, they are revealing that they are Marxists. We know all throughout history that Marxism always ends up in wholly intolerant behavior that ends in a catastrophe. And therefore, we have absolutely no onus on us, once we understand what we're seeing, to be tolerant to that BS.
I think that's a great understanding of things, because I think a lot of people, for example, when Jordan Peterson used to try a few years ago to say, this is Marxism, I think a lot of people maybe didn't quite recognize what was going on. And our writer, Jonathan Church, for instance, has talked about this at length. And I did an interview with him about a year ago, probably this week, where he was talking about that sort of replacing of the proletariat and that dynamic with a racial dynamic. And I think that's really interesting. So I wanted to ask you about, just jumping back to the University of Austin question, people like, I think it was Yoram Hazony, for instance, when he saw the initial announcement about it, said, oh, another liberal university. That's how we got here in the first place. And I think there's this big sort of schism going on between a lot of people who are critical of this, of whether or not to stick with liberalism or whether or not they favor sort of some of the answers that Patrick Deneen and others put forward that are kind of like we talked about before, harnessing state power to certain ends. And I know, for instance, you were recently, and Amari mentioned it, you were quoted in an article and it was talking about, James Lindsay used to be kind of sympathetic to the liberal cause and now maybe is metamorphosized a little bit. And Amari says, I wonder why. Look at what's been happening in the past couple of years. And, it's an open question in my mind of what the best solution to this is. Do people who are concerned about this stick with the broadly liberal project, or do they start to move over to sort of this national conservative movement that's been gaining steam in the past recent years?
I'm still completely pro yellow flag liberalism.
Right.
I am not okay with squishy spined liberalism, though. You have to have a steel spine in your liberalism. What kind of government did you create, sir? We created a republic if we can keep it. The if you can keep it part requires a steel spine. And the liberal republic, I think, is the right model of governance for big, diverse, successful, flourishing societies. I am not a post-liberal in that regard. I'm not metamorphosizing, but my spine is definitely steeling up. And I realize that we are going to have to take some harder action than we have in decades to preserve the idea of having a liberal republic. So I haven't gone post-liberal, but I do realize that the if you can keep it part wasn't just this kind of glib comment that was tacked on. Was that Franklin who said that? The republic, if you can keep it? One of the founders said this. It may have been Jefferson. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it might be Jefferson.
Came out of the room, and the
Right.
woman said, out of the meeting where they framed the Constitution. Well, what kind of government did you give us, sir? A republic, if we can keep it.
Right.
And so we have to have that if we can keep it attitude, which is, in my opinion, what they're advocating for. The softest version of what they're saying is what we see with Putin. They often invoke names like Pinochet and Franco. I've even heard praise for Hitler, and I'm not getting on board with that. Right. I mean, I read Mein Kampf. I see where Hitler was in some regards.
I'm with you, James, because last week I was having a discussion with someone who's part of the National Conservative Movement, and I said, basically the kind of old school liberal argument is you don't want to justify people having that much power to invoke their views on you for a whole plethora of reasons. Correct. And being steeped in the American context like I am, I was raised on that notion that we have this sort of, you don't want to, it's kind of somewhat of a libertarian notion, but you don't want to give the state that much power to shove views down your throat, because one day it'll be a view you don't like.
That's right.
You're born.
The special sauce of Americanism is decentralization of power. What we're dealing with now is a way where power was able to coalesce.
Well, that's what they say is the fundamental view, for example, of Michael Oakeshott, is that you want to keep power diffused and you don't want it too concentrated. And that's maybe his most fundamental belief.
I agree with that idea. I think that's the secret sauce to free societies, is diffusing power. And so, maybe these integralists or whoever else, these post-liberals, are going to come in, and given the circumstances today, maybe they're going to thread the needle. Maybe they're going to, and they're going to be the benevolent emperor. And they're going to, for what, 15 years? 10 years, 20 years. And then what happens? If you've read Chinese history, you know about the bad emperor problem, which is what they call it. It's great when you have a good emperor, but one bad emperor and you have a catastrophe on your hands.
Absolutely.
And so this is not even if it opens the door to a short-term solution, it is not even necessarily a good one. And because power corrupts, we don't want to put absolute power in one place. We want to
completely agree with you.
The fusion of power. So what about the question of University of Austin? Oh, good, another liberal university. That's what I was expressing that I'm concerned about. If they don't have techniques and a mindset like is presented in Pincourt's book and Counter Wokecraft, then they're not prepared to deal with the threat that is attacking every existing institution. That said, if they can maintain this and they can actually have a liberalism that keeps out the various viruses to liberalism that communism has represented over the past 150 years, by being willing to have that steel spine and to understand what they're up against and to adopt literally practices like described in chapter 3 of Counter Wokecraft, like the secret ballot voting and formal decision-making processes, etc., then they have a fighting chance. Maybe they're not going to be the model, but maybe they are. But maybe they're not going to be the model, but they're still going to start in the direction toward creating something that can push back. And that puts that incentive structure in place, where what I think with the universities in the long run is that I'm very cynical about this. I think that they're going to hold on to the woke mantle or whatever mantle as long as they can. And then when they no longer can stay competitive doing that, they're going to very cynically turn around and pretend they never really participated in it, or that they were trying to do it right and, had the best intentions or whatever. And they're going to kind of like come back along. So the university system is going to have to will play follow the leader and then use its massive institutional resources to dash ahead of the things that actually brought it back around, like University of Austin or Ralston College. There will be, I think, there are some small private schools that are starting to take a stand that will lead this way as well. And there are, I think we're going to see, I think in this next 6 months or 12 months or so, we're going to start to see some actual major established universities taking a stand. I know that, for example, University of Chicago at Concordia, but not the full campus, is taking a stand. And that's significant. Not the big U of Chicago, but their Concordia campus apparently has decided to take this stand. There are rumblings at other universities I shouldn't mention, but I'm getting the impression that we're going to see a handful of significant universities throughout the country take this stand. And what we'll see is others are going to stick their finger in the air and read the wind. And very cynically, I feel they're going to follow where it goes. But the techniques of something like Counter Wokecraft, I think, because they are premised on the liberal decision-making processes, are absolutely crucial to making those projects a success.
So last question. When Charles and I were wrapping up the other day, he emphasized that one of the keys to it all, because I asked him a question, if you're a student, you're that faculty member, and I was that student, what do you do? And he said the key thing that you have to keep in mind is a lot of the people who are initially very opposed to this are more individuals who kind of keep to themselves and are maybe less collaborative in his view. And he was kind of maybe spitballing a little bit. And then he said, the key point that I would tell them is you can't do it alone. You need to get together with other people and create that sort of counter group that's opposed to the sort of coalescing group of people who are supporting the other side. And he said that the key point is you must find like-minded people and kind of like maybe they'd say in the 60s, organize, and you need to organize with those people. And I was just wondering, kind of as we wrap up, how you would respond to how Charles closed.
No, that's exactly right. The truth is that what you have to start doing is you have to speak up. You have to make it clear enough where other like-minded people might find you. So you have to, I mean, obviously it depends on how oppressive your environment is with this, that determines the limits of what you can do. But you want to start finding ways, like, let's say you're that isolated individual, we'll start there. You want to find ways to start to signal that, you're somebody that is going to be more able to you can talk about this without flipping out. Like, you're not going to go woke on somebody. And then the goal is to start getting people together. Then the next stage is those people need to start sharing information and getting informed. When they become informed, then they have to start to organize. There are actually within like movements within teachers and parents right now, they're now to the point where you have actually people that are taking that process and they want that organic thing to start happening. And then, like, I actually heard somebody say this the other day, an activist say this, that when you get to the stage where you're starting to organize, I want to meet with you. I want to get on a Zoom call with you. I want to do a series of meetings with you and teach you how to build a war room where you start to find more people and you start to organize and build out. And then you can take this on. It's man versus machine. The machine's going to beat you every time. And I don't mean like a machine like Terminator. I mean machine like, the gigantic institutional apparatus. You cannot beat your university's institutional apparatus as an individual. This got in through a lot of subterfuge and infiltration, but it also got in through a lot of protests and mass action. And both of those tactics have to be used back in reverse. That's where Charles is talking about getting on committees, et cetera. But if you're just the average individual, especially as a student, you've got to start organizing with other students, probably in an underground fashion. You actually want to stay under the radar as long as you can, meeting, in person, not advertising it everywhere, not just building a website and a Facebook group and like, hey, look at us. Obviously, nobody in college is on Facebook, but you follow me. It could be a different.
I've heard about this, the move away from Facebook.
Facebook sucks. It's just terrible. It's just like terrible. I actually don't even have a Facebook. I technically have one for my like business or whatever aspect of it. I don't even have one. I just like, I'm done with this company. Terrible. And I only have one because my business partners make me have one. So advice, get off Facebook. But the point is, once you start to organize after, so it's start to get together, start to get informed, start to organize, start to grow, then you can start to take actual action. You have to follow that. There's an essay, anybody who wants to get involved in this, on top of reading Counter Wokecraft, there's an essay. I don't know if you know who Tim Urban is. Tim Urban has a site called Wait But Why. So wait, like wait in line, but like, yeah, but that's not true. And why, WHY, wait, but why? And he writes better explainers for things, for complicated ideas than anybody I think I've ever run into. And he has this essay. You can Google Wait But Why or Tim Urban or whatever, but probably Wait But Why and Human Colossus. And he talks about basically what it is political formations, and he pictures them as gigantic human colossus like giants. And the thing is they have a giant and you are an individual. And maybe you can pull a David versus Goliath moment, but those don't come up very often. If you can build your own colossus, then it can punch the other colossus in the head. This is all metaphors because colossuses are made up of lots of people. There's no punching in the head, actually, but you get what I'm saying. And so I would encourage people who want to start organizing to read that and to understand the nature of what they're up against is actually one of these huge collective giants. And if you're, I guess, a faith, you can read the David versus Goliath story and all of the faith-based, thinking that has. But if you're not, you can still read this and understand, oh, what we need is actually to get together, get informed, then organize, and then grow, and then start taking action as you grow. Because when you become bigger and bigger and bigger, you become able to do this. Now, the other piece to that, though, is in this kind of very diffused power, weird cancel culture environment. You let's steal from them. If you read, I don't know if you know who the World Economic Forum goon of Klaus Schwab is, but Klaus Schwab, they've got these things that we're not going to get into this, but the environmental, social governance. ESG
I've seen some posts about this.
Yeah, so we don't have to talk about that, but Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum, well, I don't know who actually wrote it, but somebody published it for the World Economic Forum a year or so ago. And there's lots of stuff. Klaus Schwab uses this word in his own books all the time, is we should add to ESG, we should add R for resilience. And so I want to focus on that also. The thing you build needs to be resilient. You actually have to they know how things work a little bit, and they understand that resilience is necessary. Well, if you read Martin Gurry's book, Revolt of the Public, you understand that resilience exists in diffused networks, where if a node in the network gets knocked down, the other nodes can come in and kind of nourish it back to health. You don't want this one single thing that can just get kind of knocked down. You kind of want this diffused network. So we talk about building human colossuses, but really what you want to build, they have the blob that eats and digests everything. You actually want to build a counter blob that can eat and digest.
I'm glad you brought up networks, because that's sort of one of the main things that people are talking about these days. And it's an interesting application to this context is in these institutions or in the university.
I think within the realm of the existence of social media, which has changed the world fundamentally, I think that is necessary. You need networks and the networks of networks. So for example, you see different organizations pushing back in different domains. And it's easy to look, for example, in education, which I end up talking to people a lot. So you have like Moms for Liberty, you have Parents Defending Education.
Well, it seems like there's been some success recently by some of these groups.
Very much.
And I think that they've been successful. I think one of the main things they've done, to the point of what we were discussing earlier, is they've made people aware of the particulars. And you mentioned
and they get people on the ground at the local level active. Right. And so what I talked to a lot of the people that are kind of in leadership in these various organizations. Like I said, I named 3 or 4: Moms for Liberty, Parents Defending Ed, No Left Turn in Education, Moms for America. There's a Utah Parents United. There's a whole bunch of them. And the question was, should we kind of like come together as kind of one huge parents movement thing? And I was like, there should be a parents movement, but it should stay diffuse, networked. Moms for Liberty, I know the most about of all of these different organizations, so I can speak a little bit more about it. It's already a diffuse network. Each chapter in Moms for Liberty, there's no like central command that tells them how they all have to be. There's like guidelines and some ideas that they share in common, and packets of what the strategies and the objectives and the values and the mission look like. But they're a diffuse. Every single chapter, and they're in like 31 states, there's like 160 of them or something now, is its own entity doing its own thing, kind of in its own way. And so it's a network. And then if all these other ones are networks as well, and then they network together, then you have a network of networks. And that thing has high resilience, and it's very difficult for them to do anything about it. That's how Antifa works. There is no organization of Antifa. That's how Black Lives Matter works. There's technically no organization. They're just chapters. They're all technically diffuse, and they have capitalized upon that networking approach to resilience to be able to dissolve things. And it turns out they are very, I don't want to say ossified, but they have a very solid object that they are now. The woke do. It's very clear what it is. It's becoming more clear, and as they start to lose, they're getting more desperate and become even more obvious that they're kind of Marxist totalitarians. And so that actually is something that can be dissolved through the same means back against them. And so these networks of networks of networks. So same thing at the, student level, or at the college level, or administrators or teachers or faculty members or whatever. Build a network. Don't worry about it. Do your own thing, and then try to connect with other networks and let them do their own thing.
So in a way, you're borrowing from some of their strategies, kind of fighting fire with fire, so to speak.
Well, I'm not, yes, but, and I don't like to say yes, but the truth is, I don't think I'm borrowing from their strategy, but I'm just realizing after having read Martin Gurry's book that the strategy that they're using is the one that actually fits the environment we live in. And they figured out the strategy first, and that thus they got this huge advantage in the last 10 years. And in 1 year of people fighting back this way, we've basically torn a gigantic hole.
So you're optimistic about the future of the sort of movement for, it's not good to define what you are as opposed to something else, but sort of the rediscovery of classic liberalism or the American project. And you're optimistic, because I know
cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I know a lot of people that I know and have talked to feel, especially maybe around this time last year, really outgunned, but I guess there has been some pretty tangible progress.
There's been a lot of, and it's accelerating rapidly. It's unbelievable how fast the movement of both awareness and to push back and be,
because to your point, it's that intolerant minority. So a lot of people, probably the majority of people, don't really like this, but maybe it's been masqueraded as such, especially maybe with some of the Biden campaign. And people didn't really realize that this would become almost the official line out of Washington, D.C. And there was this perception that Joe Biden was this relatively moderate guy, which knowing Joe Biden, he'll go whatever the way the wind goes. He's held every political position you could possibly hold.
He's totally corrupt.
But I think a lot of people didn't realize this, and now they're seeing it. And, since I think, as we've talked about, a small number of people actually favor this worldview, I would imagine a lot of people would want to object to it, either at the ballot box or in school board meetings or in town meetings about how resources should be distributed or anything like that.
Yeah, victory is not guaranteed, and it's going to require a lot of work. The biggest threat will actually be complacency. People looking, for example, in Virginia and saying, oh, we've got Glenn Youngkin now. We win. No, you don't win. These are insidious.
Plus, the bureaucracies are probably staff with a lot of these people at this point.
Correct.
I hear from people who work in the State Department, who work in the federal government, in state government, and that this is almost the official line within many of these, not only institutions like universities, but government organizations, taxpayer-funded entities.
Yeah, one of the principles, this comes from one of their kind of gurus, Paulo Freire, who is an education theorist, is that as you start to make progress toward Marxism, you can't be less Marxist. You have to be more Marxist. You have to you can't set critical consciousness aside. You have to gain an even more critical consciousness. So he writes that in the book called The Politics of Education in 85. And you actually have to, you can't get complacent. If we don't get complacent, we're probably going to win. They have a lot of power. They have some nasty tricks. They're going to pull it on it, but people are likely to see it. But if we get complacent and think that this thing's just going to work itself out or blow over, or that we've got some of the right people in place, especially after, say that the elections are good enough or secure enough or whatever, so that in 2022 we have a red wave or whatever, a lot of people are just going to kind of go back to sleep. That complacency is going to cause us to lose. And they're probably counting on that right now. And so that is not possible. But if we can maintain the willingness to push this danger out of our society so that we don't find ourselves in a fake pandemic or whatever again in 2 years, and then we don't find ourselves in some cyber pandemic that's going to require a great reset or whatever the goals happen to be, we all need a social credit system to prevent these bad things from happening. As long as we stay vigilant on that and keep in mind the idea of keeping this republic, and don't go to sleep because it looks like we've put some people in office who might be the right people, then I think we're going to win. So I am now optimistic. It's not going to be pretty, and it's not going to be short. The regime is a kind of a cornered animal at the moment and is going to do some dangerous stuff. But we can't become complacent as we start to mount victories. We actually have to be very adamant that we're going to go forward with what I would call that steel-spined liberalism, or a hard-spined liberalism, rather than this squishy, you do you attitude that we've kind of had for a little bit too long, and this kind of asleep at the wheel that we couldn't be conquered from within attitude.
Well, I think that's a good point, and we'll close. But with the big tech issue, for example, I think there were a lot of people who said, okay, Kevin McCarthy and others are rhetorically critical of big tech, and that maybe assuaged a lot of people's concerns. But as a number of people have pointed out, and I think that's why former President Trump was willing to go to war over that Section 230 in his final months in office. And he says, well, they might be rhetorically on board with this, but in practice, they're not actually addressing, for instance, the big tech issue. And I think that's a major, major issue when we talk about how there's a distribution of knowledge where big tech is able to elevate certain ideas, and they're, you know, able to say MW or the new discourses or whatever shouldn't have as much access in Google News or whatever. And I think that, you know, it's crucial to make sure that there's actually actions following up. So James, thanks so much for chatting with me and talking about Counter Wokecraft. And I'm now happy to have had both you and Charles give each of your perspectives on this new book, or I would even maybe describe it as a manual. And
yeah, it's a field manual.
That's kind of how I see it. And I think that Charles even describes it as that
yeah,
in the book. So thank you so much, James, and great to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, thanks.